The Galactic Council opened fire. Humanity opened hell. Part 1. The vote. The chamber was already against me before I opened my mouth. I am Yara Osai, ambassador of Earth, and I have sat in this seat for 6 years. 6 years of learning how to smile at creatures who do not have mouths. 6 years of listening to speeches delivered in 47 different languages, translated through a chip pressed against the bone behind my right ear. 6 years of watching humanity get treated like a child who wandered into a room full of adults. Today was different. Today, they were not ignoring us. Today, every eye in the chamber was pointed directly at me. The Galactic Council chamber sits inside a hollowed asteroid called Novan Station. The space inside is enormous, shaped like a bowl, with tiered seating rising from the central floor in wide concentric rings. The walls glow with a pale blue light that the Velthari species requires for their skin to stay hydrated. The temperature is kept at a level comfortable for the Sarath, which means humans have to wear thin thermal layers under their formal clothes. I had learned that detail on my first day. I never forgot it. Every single design choice in this room was made for someone other than us. Councillor Dren of the Velthari was speaking. He was tall, gray-skinned, and moved with the slow confidence of a species that had been part of this council for 9,000 years. His voice was low and smooth, and it filled the chamber without effort. He was listing our crimes. Not crimes in the way a person means when they talk about breaking a law. He was listing choices, human choices, the decision to continue metallurgical research on alloys banned under the Karath Accords, the colonization of 3 planetoids in the Reach that fell inside a disputed boundary zone, the development of what he called cognitive aggression tools, which was a phrase the Council used to describe artificial intelligence systems designed for strategic prediction. We had built one. We had not hidden it particularly well. He spoke for 40 minutes. I sat still and I listened to every word. When he finished, the floor was opened. 3 more species spoke in support of the resolution: the Thariel, the Mo, and the ancient Sul, whose representative was so old that 2 junior delegates had to hold the translation device steady near his breathing membrane. Each of them said essentially the same thing in their own way. Humanity was dangerous. Humanity moved too fast. Humanity did not understand the patience that civilization required. I requested the floor. The chamber went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when people are waiting to watch something unpleasant happen. I said what I had prepared. I spoke about the Perseverance colony ship, which was currently in transit through the Kepler Reach carrying 4,211 civilians, including children, including families who had signed 10-year relocation contracts and packed their entire lives into cargo containers. I said that the resolution as written would classify that ship as an unlawful vessel the moment it passed into the quarantine boundary. I said that the language of the resolution permitted enforcement fleets to engage any resisting human vessel, and that a colony ship carrying families was not a military target. I asked the Council to amend 2 words in the document. Councillor Dren said the resolution was complete as written. I asked for a delay of 48 hours to allow the Perseverance to alter course. The floor was closed. The vote was called. 44 in favor, 1 against. My hand raised alone in a room of 47 species. The resolution passed. Humanity was officially quarantined. All trade routes were suspended. Any human vessel found outside designated safe corridors was subject to interdiction by Council enforcement fleets. The word interdiction was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and everyone in the room knew it. I sat with my hands still raised for 3 seconds after the count was read. I do not know why. Some old human instinct, maybe, to keep the record honest. Then I lowered it and I wrote 1 line in my personal log. 4,211 people on the Perseverance. The Council just made them a problem to be solved. The session was declared closed. The chamber began to empty. Several delegates walked past me without acknowledgement. A young Thariel aide, one I had spoken with pleasantly at a reception 2 weeks earlier, looked directly at me and then looked away. I stayed in my seat for a while. My communications officer, a man named Owen Clark, came to stand beside me. Owen was 31 and had joined the diplomatic corps straight out of university. He was good at his job, and he was calm under pressure, and right now his face was the color of old paper. He said nothing. He just placed his hand on the edge of the desk in front of me, close to where my hand was resting, not touching, just near. It was the most human thing that had happened in that room all day. My translation chip clicked twice, which was the signal for an incoming priority channel from Earth Command. I pressed the receiver point and listened. The voice on the other end was General Adira Solano, head of Earth Home Fleet Command. She spoke in the flat, quiet tone that senior military officers use when they are controlling something very large inside themselves. She said, "Yara, the Perseverance has gone dark. Velthari enforcement vessels were detected in the Kepler Reach 18 minutes ago. We are no longer receiving telemetry from the ship." I said, "How long ago did the session vote pass?" She said 22 minutes. 4 minutes. They had waited 4 minutes after the vote before moving. I sat very still, and I thought about 4,211 people who had been eating breakfast or reading or putting children to sleep. All of them moving through the dark between stars, all of them trusting that the laws of civilized space would hold. Then I stood up, I straightened my jacket, I picked up my case. Owen looked at me and asked what we were going to do. I said, "Send a full incident report to Earth Command. Encrypted Priority 1. Include the full session transcript, the vote record, and my personal log entry. Send it before anything else." He said, "And after?" I looked at the chamber one last time. The blue lights, the tiered seats, the architecture of 9,000 years of someone else's peace. I said, "After that, Owen, we wait, because there is nothing left for us to do here." What I did not tell him, because I did not know how to say it yet, was the feeling that had settled into my chest the moment General Solano spoke. It was not grief, though grief was there. It was not anger, though that was there too. It was something colder and much quieter. I had spent 6 years learning how to represent humanity with patience and restraint in a room that was never designed for us. I had done it well. I had followed every rule. I had raised my hand and spoken clearly and asked politely for 2 words to be changed in a document. And 4,211 people had still been taken from the stars. Humanity had tried diplomacy. Humanity had done everything asked of it. Now something else was going to happen. I did not know what exactly. That was not my department, but I had grown up on Earth. I had studied our history. I knew what humans looked like when they went quiet after something like this. They were not surrendering. They were measuring. Part 2, the silence before. I received the news 9 hours and 14 minutes after it happened. My name is D-Young Park. I hold the rank of commander in the United Earth Home Fleet, and I serve as captain of the UEHF Rubicon, a heavy carrier currently holding position at the edge of the Meridian Corridor, approximately 60 light minutes from the nearest Council monitoring buoy. My crew numbers 312. We have been on elevated alert for 11 days. The signal came in through our deep band relay, encrypted at the highest level we use. I was in my cabin eating a meal I had let go cold when my communications officer, a young woman named Claire Webb, knocked twice and opened the hatch without waiting for my response. That told me everything before she said a word. She handed me the decoded message on a physical tablet, which we use for anything we do not want transmitted inside the ship's network. I read it once, then I read it again. Colony Vessel Perseverance, Registry EC7741, lost contact at 2:14 station time. Last known position, the Kepler Reach, grid reference 79 kilo. Velthari Enforcement Squadron confirmed in sector. No distress signal received. No survivors confirmed. Search and recovery not authorized under current council mandate. 4,211 people. I put the tablet face down on my desk, and I sat without moving for a while. Claire waited at the hatch. She was 26, and she had a younger brother who lived in a colony 2 sectors over, and I could see that she had already understood what this meant for people who lived outside Earth's direct protection. I said, "Thank you, Webb. Seal the comms room. Nothing goes out until I authorize it personally." She said, "Yes, sir," and she left. I sat alone for 12 more minutes. This is something I have never told anyone. I am telling it now because I think it matters. When something like this happens, when the number is large enough and the cause is clear enough, there is a moment that comes before the orders and before the planning. It is a very short moment, and it feels like a door closing somewhere deep inside you. Not slamming, not crashing shut. Just closing the way a door closes when someone presses it gently and holds the handle so it makes no sound. Quietly, finally. Then I stood up, straightened my uniform, and went to the bridge. At 1100 station time, the Emergency Council of Earth convened via secure relay. I was patched in as one of 14 fleet commanders included in the session. The civilian leadership was there. The military chiefs were there. Ambassador Osai's report had already been distributed. There were no speeches. I want to be very clear about that because people imagine these moments differently than they actually are. There was no dramatic declaration and no one struck a table. The session lasted 40 minutes and it was conducted in the same measured tone you might use to discuss a logistics problem. Questions were asked. Numbers were reviewed. Legal frameworks were examined and then quietly set aside. At the end of the session, Secretary General Howard Briggs spoke for 90 seconds. He said that the Council had acted outside its own founding charter by targeting a non-military civilian vessel without warning or due process. He said that under Article 14 of Earth's Sovereign Defense Compact, an unprovoked lethal action against civilians constituted an act requiring a formal response. He said that Earth was not declaring war, because declaring war would imply that the Council had the standing to be a party in a war against us. What Earth was doing, he said, was exercising its right to defend its people, its vessels, and its territory by any means it judged necessary. Then he said 2 words. "Prometheus, activate." The channel closed. For a moment no one on my bridge spoke. My first officer, a man named Colin Ash, turned from his station and looked at me. Colin had been with me for 4 years. He was steady and smart, and he had a family back on Earth, 2 daughters, and he wore their photographs tucked behind the identification panel above his console where regulations technically did not permit personal items. He said, "Is this really happening?" I said, "Yes." He looked at the main viewport at the stars and then back at me. He said, "What does Prometheus actually mean? I mean, I know the contingency designation, but what does it actually mean in practice?" I told him the truth. Contingency Prometheus had been in development for 19 years. It was not a single plan. It was a framework, a complete operational doctrine that assumed the scenario we were now inside. A hostile action by a superior, multi-species military coalition against Earth and its colonies, conducted with the intent to isolate and suppress human expansion. It had been built by a team of 300 strategists, historians, and engineers who had been given one instruction: assume we will be outgunned, outnumbered, and operating in a legal environment that does not favor us. Build a response for that world. They had done exactly that. I pulled up the first operational layer on my command screen. Prometheus was divided into 5 phases, each one triggered by confirmation of the previous. Phase 1 had been the intelligence preparation stage, which had been running quietly for 11 years. Sensor networks seeded along disputed boundaries. deep cover data relays installed in commercial shipping lanes, structural surveys of every council enforcement station within 4 sectors of human space. All of it logged, cataloged, and waiting. Phase 2 was what we were entering now. It had one name in the planning documents. It was called the Silence. All non-essential transmissions from human vessels were to cease immediately. Fleet movements were to look like retreat. Supply ships were to run dark. To every council sensor network watching human space, it needed to appear as though humanity had accepted the quarantine and was standing down. I gave the orders. Over the next 6 hours, I watched my ship become a ghost, non-essential systems powered down, exterior lighting reduced to minimum, engine output dropped to a level that would register on long-range scans as a vessel on minimal power. We were not hiding. We were performing. Every human fleet in the sector was doing the same thing, each one following the same directive, all of it coordinated without a single transmission that the Council could intercept. The Council's blockade fleet moved in on schedule, exactly as our planners had predicted. They were large ships, Velthari and Sarath built, heavy with long-range weapons systems that were designed for direct confrontation. They took up positions along the boundary corridors with the confidence of people who had never lost a war they started. I watched them on my sensor display. 36 warships sitting in formation, watching our silent space, and I knew exactly what their commanders were thinking. They were thinking we had given up. What they could not know, what no species in the galaxy could have known without reading 4,000 years of human military history, was that going quiet was not something humans did when they surrendered. Humans went quiet when they were thinking. Humans went quiet when they were deciding how to take something apart. There is a concept in our history called strategic patience. It appears in military texts going back to ancient times. It describes the discipline of waiting, not out of weakness, but out of precision. You wait until the moment you choose, not the moment your enemy forces on you. You wait until the angle is right, until your opponent has committed fully to an assumption that is about to be proven wrong. Every human fleet commander in that sector had read those texts. Every one of them understood what the silence meant. I thought about the Perseverance. I thought about what 4,211 names looked like written down. I thought about the vote record that Ambassador Osa had transmitted, the 44 hands raised against us, and the one raised for us. Colin appeared at my shoulder. He said the Council's forward ships had completed their positioning and were transmitting a mandatory acknowledgement request to all human vessels in the sector. We were supposed to confirm our compliance with the quarantine. I said, "Send the compliance signal." He looked at me. I said, "Send it, make it clean and prompt. Give them nothing to question." He sent it. The Council ships acknowledged and went back to their patrol patterns. They had no idea that while they were watching our ship sit still in the dark, 63 human engineering teams were already working on Phase 3. They had no idea that the weapons systems our strategists had spent 19 years developing had never once appeared in any document the Council had access to. They had no idea that the alloys, the intelligence systems, the tactical frameworks they had accused us of developing in violation of their accords were not the dangerous thing. The dangerous thing was that we had been studying war since before they reached the stars. Not their wars, not the clean, formal fleet engagements that the Galactic Council had codified into honorable procedure over 9,000 years. Our wars, the ugly, total, grinding, inventive kind of wars that humanity had survived again and again across every century of its existence. We had not hidden that history. It was in every library on Earth, every museum, every school curriculum. We had never been ashamed of it. The Council had looked at that history and seen barbarism. They had not understood that what they were looking at was an education. The silence held for 31 hours. Then Phase 3 began. Part 3, First Contact with Hell. The order came in at 3:40, and I was already awake. I had not slept in 20 hours, not because I was anxious. I had simply stopped needing sleep the way I used to. Something about this kind of command burns through exhaustion and replaces it with a very clean, very cold focus. My name is Sierra Voss, and I command Strike Group Leviathan. 7 ships operating under Prometheus Phase 3, tasked with the first coordinated action against Council infrastructure in human history. I want to be precise about what we targeted. This is important. We did not go after their warships. We did not engage their military directly. Our planners had spent years thinking about where a multi-species coalition was most vulnerable, and the answer they came back to, consistently, across every simulation and every historical analysis, was not the weapons. It was everything that made the weapons move. The logistics chain. The Council had enforcement fleets stationed along the quarantine boundary, but those fleets needed fuel. They needed replacement parts. They needed food for 17 different biological profiles. They needed the relay stations that carried their command signals across 6 star systems. They needed the supply depots that kept their ships operational between rotations. In 48 hours of quiet observation during the silence, our intelligence teams had mapped every critical point in that chain within our operational range. 31 targets, fuel platforms, relay nodes, deep space cargo stations, automated parts depots with no military garrison, just skeleton crews of technicians who maintained the equipment. Our rules of engagement were precise. Any station with a civilian or non-military crew was to receive a mandatory evacuation signal 30 minutes before engagement. We were not there to cause harm to workers. We were there to take the Council's reach apart, piece by piece, until their enforcement fleet could no longer sustain its position. I gave the evacuation signal personally, on every target my group was assigned. At 400 we moved. The first target was a fuel platform called Depot Kale 7, positioned at a junction point where 3 supply routes crossed. It was large, unmanned except for 6 automated maintenance systems, and it held enough processed fuel to keep 30 warships operational for 4 months. We came in from below the orbital plane. This was not an accident. The Council's sensor networks were designed to detect threats approaching along standard transit corridors and along the plane of the system's ecliptic. Our engineers had spent 3 years studying those sensor designs, and they had found a gap. Not a flaw exactly, more of an assumption built into the architecture. The assumption was that no vessel running a military operation would sacrifice the fuel efficiency required to approach from below the plane. We did it anyway. The fuel cost was factored into our loadout from the beginning. When Depot Kale 7 appeared on my forward display, it looked exactly like the intelligence photographs. A large hexagonal frame structure, white against the dark, with 6 extended arms holding fuel storage cylinders. There was no defense screen active. There was no armed patrol. Why would there be? It was a supply depot sitting in the middle of what the Council considered secured space. The idea that a human vessel would be here doing this was not something they had planned for. My weapons officer, a quiet man named Paul Heron, confirmed target lock. I said execute. Paul said executing. The strike lasted 11 seconds. Depot Kale 7 ceased to exist as a functional installation in the time it takes to count to 12. We were already turning onto the next approach vector before the debris field had fully expanded. 6 more targets fell in the next 4 hours. My group moved through that sector like something the Council had no word for, because their military doctrine had no category for it. They were watching for fleet engagements. They were waiting for human warships to line up in formation and trade fire with their own ships in the way that all civilized military conflicts in the galaxy had been conducted for 9,000 years. Instead, they got us. We moved in tight, fast, and low. We hit infrastructure and disappeared before a response force could lock our position. Our hull coatings had been developed from research into oceanic stealth technology, and they reduced our sensor signature to something that registered as background noise at distances above 40,000 kilometers. Our decoy drones were broadcasting false fleet signatures 60 light seconds away, drawing attention to empty space while we worked. Their response ships, when they finally reached the coordinates of our strikes, found wreckage in cold space. My communications officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace Thorne, intercepted a Council command transmission at 7:19. It had been scrambled, but we had the decryption keys from a signals intelligence package that had been built over 8 years of careful work. Grace decoded it in 4 minutes and read it to me from her station. The Velthari fleet commander was reporting to the Council's Joint Operations Center. His transmission said that human vessels had struck 7 infrastructure targets in a single operational window with no prior warning and no pattern consistent with any known tactical doctrine. He reported that his response forces had found no sign of the attacking vessels. He said, in the precise and formal language that senior Velthari officers used for official reports, that the engagement profile suggested the humans were not fighting according to any model currently held in Council strategic archives. Then he used a phrase that Grace translated carefully, pausing over it, because the Velthari word was not easy to render in our language. She said the closest equivalent was something like a predator that has decided it has waited long enough. I thought that was fairly accurate. But then came the moment I did not plan for. We were approaching Target 8, a relay station positioned at the far edge of the sector, when Grace called out a proximity alert. 2 Council ships, a Sareth patrol cruiser and a Velthari escort frigate, were moving on an intercept course. They were not responding to our strike. They had been repositioned by their command an hour earlier, probably as a general response to the attacks. They had stumbled across our approach vector by geometry, not intelligence. They were faster than we needed them to be. I ran the calculation in my head in about 3 seconds. We could not get clear before they reached weapons range. We could attempt evasive routing, but that would burn the fuel reserve we needed for the extraction phase. Or we could engage. I looked at Paul Heron. He looked back at me. I said, defensive posture only. We protect the group. We do not pursue. The engagement lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I'm not going to make it sound exciting, because for the people inside it, it was not exciting. It was loud and it was fast, and it required every person on my bridge to do their job better than they had ever done it before. Our ships took hits. The shields on our second vessel, the Copley, dropped to 30% before we could create enough distance. Then one of our long-range rounds found the Sareth cruiser's propulsion assembly and took it offline. The Velthari frigate pulled back to cover its partner. We broke contact and ran. When I had a moment to breathe, I turned to my first officer to give the next navigation order. His station was empty. My first officer was named Dale Crawford. He had been with me since before my command of Leviathan. He had a sister who ran a bakery on the outskirts of a colony in the Dendra system, and he used to bring back packages of her pastries when he rotated home, and he would hand them out on the bridge like it was a completely normal thing to do in the middle of deep space deployment. He was 38 years old. The strike that had taken his station down had been clean and very fast. He had not had time to say anything. I stood at his station for 4 seconds. I logged his name in the mission record. I noted the time. Then I moved to the command chair and I gave the next order, because that is what the moment required. What I knew, and what I held onto through everything that followed, was that this was not what humanity wanted. We did not come to the stars looking for this. We came looking for everything that the council chambers and the relays and the colonization routes represented. A future with more room in it, more possibility, more of the things that a species reaches for when it is done surviving and ready to live. We had wanted to belong to the galaxy. They had made that impossible, and so we were doing the only other thing humans have ever been truly excellent at. We were making the cost of opposing us too high to pay. By the end of the operational window, 23 of the 31 targets had been neutralized across 4 strike groups operating simultaneously across the sector. The Council's forward enforcement fleet had lost access to 60% of its local fuel supply. 2 relay nodes were down. A critical parts depot had been evacuated and then stripped of its inventory by a boarding team from Strike Group Kappa before the evacuation was even complete. The Council's command network was flooding with reports, and the reports all said the same thing in different ways. Something is wrong. This is not how they were supposed to fight. I transmitted a brief status report to Fleet Command, and then I sat in the quiet of my bridge, and I looked at Dale Crawford's empty station, and I thought about what we were building here, in this dark, and in this silence between stars. We were building a message, and it was being received. Part 4, when they finally understood. My name is Threshvi. I served as Senior Policy Counselor for the Velthari Directorate for 22 years. What I am about to say was given as formal testimony to the Galactic Council's Post-Conflict Review Commission and was later translated into 17 languages, including Human Standard English, at the request of Ambassador Yara Osai, who asked that it be included in the public record of these events. I want to begin with what we believed at the time. The Galactic Council had existed for 9,400 years at the time of the vote on Resolution 7 Omega. In that period, we had admitted 31 species as full or provisional members. Of those 31, humanity was the most recently admitted, the most rapidly expanding, and the most frequently discussed in internal security assessments. I will not pretend otherwise. We had files on human civilization that went back to the moment we first detected their broadcast signals 61 years before first contact. We had monitored their development with what I can only describe, in hindsight, as anxious attention. The reason we were anxious was their history. Every species that has ever joined the Council came to space having already resolved, at least functionally, the patterns of conflict that defined their early civilization. The Sareth had their unification compact. The Thariel had their convergent centuries. The Velthari, my own people, had the long peace that followed the Directorate's founding, which ended the last significant armed conflict in our home system approximately 4,000 years ago. By the time any of us reached the stars, war was a historical concept. We understood it academically. We had records of it, but it was behind us. Humanity was different. Humanity had been fighting itself with extraordinary creativity and consistency for as long as we had records of it. They had fought with hand weapons and then with machines, and then with systems that could affect entire populations from a distance. They had fought wars over land, over ideas, over resources, over symbols, over injuries real and imagined. They had fought wars that lasted a single afternoon and wars that shaped the course of their civilization for generations. They had fought wars that destroyed everything they had built and this was the part none of us truly processed until it was far too late, they had rebuilt. Every time. Not just rebuilt in the physical sense, though they did that with a speed that other species found remarkable. They rebuilt institutionally. They examined what had happened, identified what had failed, and restructured themselves to prevent the same failure. Their entire political and legal architecture was the accumulated product of a species that had made every possible mistake and had survived each one and had asked itself, each time, how to do better next time. We looked at this history, and we saw a species that had not yet grown out of its violent phase. We did not understand that what we were looking at was the most comprehensively stress-tested civilization in the known galaxy. When the vote passed on Resolution 7 Omega, our military planners estimated that human response capability would be limited to defensive posturing and possibly isolated retaliatory strikes against border installations. We estimated that within 60 days, The economic pressure of the quarantine would force a negotiated settlement on terms favorable to the Council. These estimates were prepared by our best analysts, using the most sophisticated modeling systems available to us. I am telling you now that every single assumption in those estimates was wrong. Not wrong in the way that intelligence projections are sometimes slightly off. Wrong in the way that a person is wrong when they attempt to predict the behavior of something they have fundamentally misunderstood. The first thing that surprised us was the silence. When our enforcement fleets moved in and human space went quiet, our commanders interpreted this as compliance, as submission. The concept of strategic deception of this kind at this scale, conducted as a deliberate operational phase with a precise activation trigger, did not exist in our tactical doctrine. It had no category. When our analysts reviewed the silence afterwards, they found that it had lasted exactly as long as the human planning models required for Phase 3 preparation. Every minute of it had been intentional. The second thing that surprised us was the targeting. We expected, if there was a response, that it would come at our warships. That is where military responses come in every conflict in our recorded history. You strike the weapons. You fight the fleet. You contest territory through direct confrontation. This is what war looks like in every civilized engagement we have ever recorded or studied. Human Strike Group Leviathan and 3 other groups hit our supply network instead. Our fleet commander at Kepler Station reported to me personally after the first operational window. He was not a man given to dramatic language. He had served in 2 previous Council enforcement actions and had handled both with calm professionalism. When I asked him to describe what had happened, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he said, "They took away our ability to sustain the engagement without ever engaging us directly. They did not fight the war. They took away the ground the war would have been fought on." I found this comment so unusual that I recorded it verbatim in my personal log. The third thing that surprised us was the speed of learning. By the time our forces developed a preliminary countermeasure to the approach vector pattern used in the first wave of strikes, the human groups had already shifted to 3 alternate approach profiles that our countermeasure did not cover. Our analysts needed 6 hours to identify each new pattern. The humans were operating on a cycle of 4 hours and 20 minutes. We were always behind. I brought this to the attention of the Council's Joint Security Committee 11 days into the operation. I said that we had a significant problem. I said that our projections had been based on a model of human military behavior that did not match the human military behavior we were observing. I said that we needed to reconsider our assumptions and that we needed to do it quickly. The committee asked me what new model I was proposing. I said I did not have one. I said that I had been reviewing available human historical texts for 5 days, and that I had not found a conflict in their history that resembled what they were doing to us, because, in their own past, they had always been the ones doing this to others only when they were the ones with more power. When they were the ones under pressure, when they were outnumbered and outgunned and facing a larger adversary, they had fought this way, with deception and patience and strikes at infrastructure, and a willingness to absorb loss without breaking. What I could not find in their history was a point at which this approach had failed them in the long term. The committee was not ready to hear that. It took another 14 days and the loss of 4 Council enforcement vessels, not in pitched battle, but to what our damage assessors could only describe as extraordinarily precise ambush, before the committee agreed to review its position. The ceasefire proposal came from the Sarath delegation, who had the least invested in the quarantine and the most invested in restoring trade routes. They drafted a document and presented it to the Council as a framework for negotiation. It was measured and reasonable, and it proposed a return to the status quo ante with a joint review committee to address the original grievances on both sides. We transmitted it to Earth through the one open diplomatic channel that Ambassador Osai had kept active. I remember the day we waited for the response. When it came back, it was not what we expected. Humanity's response was not a counter-proposal. It was a list, a complete, precisely itemized, legally formatted list of terms. The list had clearly been prepared by people who had thought about this moment for a very long time. It referenced specific clauses of the Karath Accords. It cited council precedents going back 400 years. It used our own legal architecture against us with a fluency that indicated a level of preparation we had not imagined. The terms included full recognition of human sovereign space, with defined boundaries, formal council acknowledgement that Resolution 7 Omega had been applied illegally to a civilian vessel, reparative compensation to be paid by the Velthari Directorate to the families of those lost on the Perseverance, permanent seats for human representatives on the Council's security and legal review bodies, and a new foundational clause to be added to the Karath Accords themselves, which they called Article 0, prohibiting any preemptive enforcement action against a member species without unanimous vote and a 60-day diplomatic review period. The last item on the list was this: the names of all 4,211 individuals aboard the Perseverance were to be recorded in the preamble of the new amended Accords as permanent acknowledgement of the cost of the Council's failure. The committee read the list in silence. One of my colleagues asked how long I thought humanity had been preparing this document. I said, I believe they prepared it before the first shot was fired. I believe they knew, from the moment the vote passed, where this would end. They prepared their military response and their diplomatic resolution simultaneously, because that is what they do. They do not separate the fighting from the peace. They plan for both at the same time. There was silence around the table. Then I said the thing I had been working toward for 3 weeks of sleepless nights, reading human history. I said, we made a mistake that we cannot afford to repeat. We looked at a species that had suffered enormously and endured consistently and rebuilt repeatedly, and we decided they were dangerous because of their violence. We did not ask what that violence had cost them or what they had learned from it. We treated their history as a warning about who they were. We never once asked what it had made them into. I have had many years since these events to sit with that thought. I believe it is the most important thing I said in my career. Part 5: The New Accord. The chamber looked the same. I noticed that immediately when I walked in. The same blue light in the walls for the Velthari, the same cold temperature for the Sarath, the same enormous bowl shape with the tiered seating rising in rings from the central floor, the same asteroid rock above and below and all around, the same pale glow of Novan Station's ancient corridor lights in the passage behind me. The chamber looked the same. Almost nothing else did. I am Yara Osai. I returned to this seat 341 days after the day I left it, with my case under my arm and Owen Clark beside me, and the vote record of 44-1 still warm in the air. I returned on different terms. Earth's diplomatic delegation now occupied 7 seats instead of 1, spread across a wider section of the tier. 3 of those seats were held by colleagues I had worked with for years. 3 were new appointments, brought in specifically for the constitutional negotiations that had been running for 4 months. The 7th seat, in the center, with a small carving of Earth's continental shapes on the armrest that one of our engineers had added quietly during the installation, that seat was mine. I sat down in it and I placed my hands flat on the desk, and I looked out at the chamber. Across the floor, the Velthari delegation was present in reduced numbers. Their senior counselor, a woman named Dea Hearn, who had replaced Counselor Dren following his formal censure, met my eyes when I looked in her direction. She did not look away. I respected that. She had not been part of the vote. She had been given an impossible job of representing a species that had started something it did not know how to finish, and she had done it with a steadiness that I had come to appreciate during the months of negotiation. Owen Clark sat 2 seats to my left, now serving as my chief of staff. He had aged in ways I had not fully registered until I saw a photograph of him from before. The lines around his eyes were deeper. The way he held his shoulders had changed, a subtle forward set that was not there before. He was still the best person I knew at what he did, and he still had the precise handwriting I had always associated with people who are good at keeping records in the middle of difficult situations. The session was called to order by Director Marin of the Soul, who had been selected as the presiding neutral officer for the signing ceremony precisely because the Soul had abstained from the original vote on Resolution 7 Omega. Director Marin was ancient even by Soul standards, moved very slowly, and spoke in a voice like sound traveling through deep water. He was also, I had learned during the negotiations, one of the sharpest procedural minds on the council. He had caught 3 significant errors in the draft accord text during review and had fixed them with quiet precision before anyone else had noticed them. He opened the session. He noted for the record the date, the location, and the parties present. He stated that the session had been convened for the purpose of ratifying the amended Karath Accords, including the addition of Article 0 and the simultaneous signing of the Human Sovereign Space Recognition Treaty and the Perseverance Reparations Agreement. Then he paused for a moment. He looked across the chamber. I had the impression that he was doing something he did not do often, which was speaking not as a procedural officer, but as an individual who had been alive long enough to understand the weight of certain moments. He said, "These documents represent a correction. The Council has an obligation to acknowledge that corrections of this kind carry cost. The cost in this instance was borne by people who are no longer present to see this chamber act more wisely than it did before. Let that be held in mind throughout this session." No one spoke after that for a full 30 seconds. Then the signing began. I signed for Earth. Dea Hearn signed for the Velthari Directorate. The representatives of 12 other species signed in the order established by their entry date into the Council. Director Marin signed last, as presiding officer, and he pressed the formal seal of the Council next to his name with the careful deliberation of a person who understands the difference between doing a thing and doing a thing correctly. When it was done, the clerk read the first line of the Accord's preamble aloud, as protocol required for any document amending the foundational legal framework of the Council. The preamble began with the names. All 4,211 of them. It took 14 minutes to read them all. The chamber was completely silent for every one of those 14 minutes. I had heard the names before, many times in briefings and reports and the official incident record. But hearing them read aloud in this room, in this specific silence, was different. Each name landed in the space between the blue walls and the pale light and the ancient stone, and it stayed there. I did not try to hold myself together in the way that I sometimes have to in formal settings. I had made the decision, some weeks before, to be honest in this room about what this day was and what it cost. So when the tears came, I let them. Owen looked straight ahead at the clerk and his jaw was very tight. Several delegates around me were still. A few were not. The last name was read. The clerk closed the document. Director Marin recorded the completion in the official session log. We had done it. What came next was not a celebration. We had agreed on that early in the planning process, all of us on the human delegation. There would be no speeches about victory. There would be a brief formal reception, required by protocol, and there would be the practical work of beginning the implementation period for the new treaties, which was going to take years and would require constant attention and would probably produce at least 40 more arguments before it was finished. There was no clean ending here. There was only the next step. But before the reception, before anything else, I took 20 minutes. I told Owen I would meet him in the corridor, and I sat alone in my seat, and I looked at the chamber. I thought about the months that had preceded this day, the weeks of negotiation in which every clause of the new accord had been argued, refined, challenged, and defended. The exhausting back and forth over the definition of sovereign space and the precise legal language of Article 0, and the question of how reparations would be calculated and paid. The moments of real difficulty when it had seemed like the whole process might collapse over a single disputed paragraph. The moments of unexpected quiet, late in sessions when everyone was tired, when the genuine work of two species trying to understand each other had surfaced briefly through the formal language and the procedural structure. I thought about what it had taken to get here. General Solano had told me, in a private conversation during the operational phase, that the human fleet had lost 61 personnel across all strike groups. 61 people who had gone into the dark and not come back. She had given me their names in a separate document, and I had added them to the list I was keeping alongside the 4,211, because they were part of the same story and they needed to be in the same place. I thought about Dale Crawford, whose name had been in Sierra Voss's operational report, about Colin Ash, who had served on the Rubicon and whose daughters were now old enough to understand what their father's service had meant, about all the names on all the rosters of all the ships that had gone silent and then moved and then fought and then, finally, held the line long enough for the rest of us to do the work that ended this. I thought about the generations of people on Earth and in the colonies who had lived inside the quarantine for those months, who had kept their trade routes quiet and their ships dark and their fear private, because they had trusted that the people responsible for this were doing everything that could be done. And I thought about what Councillor Threshvi had said in his testimony, the part that had stayed with me since the translation arrived on my desk. He had written, "We assumed that because they were new to the stars, they were new to suffering." I understood why he had made that mistake. Looking at humanity from the outside, from 9,000 years of relative peace and managed progress, what you saw was a young species, enthusiastic, fast-moving, loud, prone to argument, still carrying habits and instincts that other species had left behind centuries ago. You did not see, unless you looked very carefully and with a willingness to understand rather than judge, what those habits and instincts had been forged in. You did not see the long record of what we had endured and what we had built and what we had lost and what we had refused to give up. You did not see the stubbornness at the core of us, the deep, particular kind of stubbornness that belongs to a species that has faced the possibility of its own end too many times to find it frightening anymore. We had not won this because we were stronger. The Council's combined military capability was still vastly larger than ours. We had won it because we had understood something about this kind of conflict that they had not. The goal was never to defeat them. The goal was to make the cost of continuing too high to pay, and then to have the legal and diplomatic architecture ready to offer them a better option the moment they were willing to accept one. War and peace, prepared simultaneously, because that is what you do when you cannot afford to separate them. I stood up and picked up my case. The reception was in a room off the main corridor, and as I walked toward it, I passed a young Velthari diplomat standing near the doorway. She was clearly junior, probably in her first posting, and she was watching the delegates move past with the wide-eyed attention of someone who is trying to memorize everything. She looked about as young as Owen had when I first met him. She saw me approaching and straightened slightly. Then, in careful standard English, she said, "Ambassador Osai, may I ask you something?" I stopped. I said, "Yes." She said, "How did your people endure all of it? The quarantine, the everything. How does a species keep going when something like that happens to it?" It was a genuine question. She was not trying to be diplomatic or careful. She was asking the way young people ask things when they really want to know. I thought about it for a moment, not to construct an answer but to find the honest one. I said, "We have had a lot of practice, not just at the hard parts, at the part that comes after, at standing up the next morning and deciding to continue. We are not the strongest species in this galaxy. We are probably not the smartest, but we have been doing this, the surviving and the rebuilding and the trying again part, for longer than most civilizations have been watching the stars. It does not make the hard parts small. It makes us stubborn in a way that is hard to explain until you have seen it. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Is it something that can be learned?" I said, "I think everything can be learned, given enough time." She thought about that. Then she thanked me and stepped back to let me pass. I walked into the reception. Owen handed me a drink. The room was full of people making the careful, cautious, necessary conversation that comes after a long conflict, the kind of talk that is not trust yet, but is the beginning of the conditions in which trust might eventually grow. I stood in the middle of it and I thought, we are still here. Not just surviving, not just enduring in the way that a person endures something painful by gritting their teeth and waiting for it to stop, here in the full sense of the word. Present, awake, taking up the space we had earned and planning for the space we had not yet reached, building the next thing and the thing after that. 4,211 names were in the preamble of a document that would govern the behavior of every spacefaring species in this part of the galaxy for the foreseeable future. That was not nothing. That was not the footnote of tragedy. That was a foundation. I had spent my career in diplomacy because I believed, and continue to believe, that the most durable outcomes come from the table and not the battlefield. But I had also learned, in the 341 days between the day I left this chamber alone and the day I returned to it with 6 colleagues beside me, that the table only exists because someone was willing to hold the line long enough for it to be set up. We had done that. We were still doing it. The work was not finished. It would not be finished in my lifetime, or probably in the lifetimes of the young Velthari diplomat in the corridor, or of Owen Clark's children, or of any of the people in this room. The work of building something that lasts does not finish. It only changes form. But tonight the names were in the record. Tonight the accords were signed. Tonight the light from Novan Station's pale corridors fell on a chamber where 44 had once voted against us, and where, now, our 7 seats sat among the others as a permanent, legal, undeniable fact. They had opened fire. We had opened something they could not close again. And that for tonight was enough.